14. A swarm of black flies. Posey was slurping up ramen, doctored with a ton of chili garlic sauce, when Charlie emerged from the bedroom. Dressed in leggings and an oversized shirt, Posey had pulled her brown hair into a single braid. Normal, except that she was also wearing eyeliner, lip gloss, and calf-high zip-up boots. She was planning on going somewhere. Charlie just hoped it wasn't a lab. "Okay, so you wanted to talk to me without Vince around," Charlie said, forcing herself to concentrate on this conversation and not everything she'd learned. "What for?" Posey poked at her bowl. "You're not going to tell me why you trashed your bedroom?" Maybe she should get a tarot reading, like saps everywhere. Maybe she needed to hear someone else say it. He's no good. "You go ahead with your thing first." "Fine. So, last night, I was talking to this guy." Charlie abruptly wished she'd said a lot less the night before. "You told me you wouldn't." "I stopped arguing with you," Posey said. "I never actually agreed to do what you said." With one stupid phone call, Charlie had almost gotten herself killed. What would happen if Salt somehow heard Posey's story and linked it to Hermes? "I was careful," Posey insisted. "Take it down. Whatever you put out there, take it down." Charlie looked around for Posey's laptop as though she could toss it into the Nashawanic pond and somehow that would remove what she'd posted from the internet. "It wasn't online," Posey insisted. "It was an encrypted chat that deletes everything after it's read." Charlie sat down at the table. Her head was throbbing. The events of the last 24 hours were too much. She wanted to curl up in a dark hole and maybe engage in some screaming therapy. "Forget about all that for a minute," Posey said, "because that's not the part I want to talk to you about." "Fuck," Charlie said, lacking any more coherent response. "There's a graduate student over at UMass, Madurai Malhar-Ear. He's been working on a doctoral dissertation on quickening shadows. The guy who told me about him had been trying to get Malhar to talk to him for ages, but Malhar kept blowing him off." Charlie had a feeling she knew what was coming next, and that she was going to hate it. "I knew you weren't going to agree to meet him, so I wrote to him and said all that stuff that happened to you happened to me. Only..." Charlie stared at her unhelpfully. "Only I can't go alone," Posey finished. "Why not?" "Because it didn't happen to me," Posey said, as though that should be obvious. Charlie stuck a fork into her sister's ramen and let the hot chili sear her mouth as she ate it. "That sounds like a big problem for you." "I told him we could meet him at the UMass library tonight to talk," Posey finished, voice lilting up in the manner of someone who wants to ask something without asking it. "Tonight?" No, Charlie said, holding up her hands. "No way am I going. That's not happening." Posey narrowed her eyes. "Busy with something? Planning on ransacking the living room?" Charlie got up. "Last night was real bad, and I definitely don't want to discuss it with a stranger today." "You lied about meeting Caitlin. I know you did. You were looking for something, and you didn't want Vince to be here when you did it." Her threat was implied, but effective nonetheless. They stood staring at one another. Charlie's hands had unconsciously curled into fists so tightly that her nails were pressing into her palms. "Don't do this." "I don't have a car." At least drive me, Posey said. Please. Charlie groaned and headed for her room. Where are you going? Posey called after her. To get my coat. She passed Lucifer, tail lashing, staring at one of the walls near the bathroom. Sometimes you could hear mice scrabbling in there, and it set the cat on edge. She supposed they were all on edge these days. Back in the bedroom, Charlie tried to put it into a semblance of order, making up the mattress with new sheets to give her the alibi of cleaning if anything was out of place. As they pulled out of the driveway, Charlie's thoughts were a jumble of memories of Salt's murder of Rand and the ease with which Vince had covered up a murder the night before. Had he killed for his grandfather? Had he killed that girl they found dead in his car for Salt? Had he killed her for himself? Vince had been careful and thorough and unnervingly competent, but he hadn't seemed as though he'd liked murder or was eager to do it again. She had a hard time imagining him hurting someone for fun. Of course, it's not as though she would have easily imagined him standing in the middle of the sort of gala that she'd only seen on television, wearing an outfit likely to cost more than her car, and guzzling champagne that was allowed to use the capital C because it came from the right region of France. It was possible that Charlie had a severely stunted imagination. So tell me about this guy, Malhar, Charlie said to distract herself. She shrugged. I don't know that much. He seemed nice over chat. No offense, Posey, but there are a lot of graduate students in the Valley, and they're just that, students. What makes you think this guy has that much more information than you do? I mean, you spend every night online doing research. You've probably read a million accounts of Quicken Shadows. Posey's frown deepened. I don't do research, though. People can make up stories or exaggerate for attention. Videos can be faked. I might know a lot, but so many things I've thought were real turned out not to work. Meanwhile, he's authenticating the information he gets. He has proof. Posey shifted uncomfortably in her seat, possibly because the seats were, like everything else in the Corolla, kind of busted. Speaking of which... What? Charlie said. Posey made a face. I might have exaggerated some things, too. For his attention. Charlie looked out the window at the darkening sky. I guess you got it. After that, Posey was silent all the way until they crossed the Calvin Coolidge Memorial Bridge. The University of Massachusetts rose like a surprise city in the middle of nowhere, complete with a football stadium, tall buildings, traffic jams, and a miniature Stonehenge. If you took a wrong turn at a farmer's market, you got surrounded by a swarm of students, arriving every year like locusts, thirsty for beer and boba tea. Students were the lifeblood of the valley, and if Charlie resented them, she knew she needed them as much as anyone if she wanted to keep slinging drinks. And soon Posey would be one of them, and go on with them to a future full of possibilities. At least, that was the hope. Charlie parked in an enormous lot, one that was marked with some letters that might or might not mean she was in the right place. As they got out, Charlie once again regretted her leather coat's lack of warmth. The sun slipped low and red in the distance. They could see the lightning farm over in Sunderland, harvesting energy with ominous crackles and strikes. You okay? Charlie asked. I just can't imagine coming here every day, Posey said. They stood there for a few seconds until Charlie reminded Posey that she was the one with the directions. She frowned at her phone for a while. I think we're supposed to go toward that pond. They got lost twice, wandering through the campus, passing clumps of students in Uggs and pajama pants. A black woman with an on-point eyeliner game sat outside the student center, reading a feminist translation of Beowulf. A white boy tried to hand Charlie a flyer for an anime festival. 3 guys in team sweats jogged by. Vince had gone to a school like this, sitting in lectures, learning to fence. A more expensive university, one that was supposed to spit him out ready to rule over the less fortunate. He'd had everything: money, privilege, power. For the first time, Charlie wondered what could have possibly made him run away. Madurai Malhar Iyer was waiting for them in the lobby of the library. He was a tall guy, young, with brown skin, wearing wire-rimmed glasses and a flannel over a t-shirt. Slender, in a way that spoke of spending so much time studying that he forgot to eat. "I'm Posey," Posey said. "And this is my sister, Charlie." Malhar signed them in as his guests and led them into a study room in the back. "Thanks for agreeing to meet me so quickly," he said as they walked through the stacks. Posey nodded, obviously a little embarrassed. She wanted to impress him, Charlie realized. Malhar swung his bag over his shoulder and set it down on the table, removing his laptop and a notebook. Several pens fell out, an apple rolling behind them. "Do you want anything? There's a coffee machine, but it's not very good. The hot chocolate is okay, but someone told me they got a boiled roach in their cup." Posey wrinkled her nose. "I'm going to pass." "I'll take the roach coffee," said Charlie. The buzz of Balthazar's candy coffee was starting to wear off, and she needed something to keep going. "I'll grab you some," he said, and then hesitated. "I'm sure it's fine. I mean, lots of people drink it." He came back with 3 cups, 2 coffees, and a hot chocolate. She supposed he felt obligated to have one himself, like a host taking the first sip of wine to show they aren't poisoning their guests. "So," he said, clearing his throat. "Posey, I'd like you to tell your story again, and I'd like to record it. Does that sound okay?" Posey pushed back her shoulders. "It was my sister, really. I told you it happened to me because she wasn't sure she wanted to talk about it. But I convinced her that it was important." His gaze went to Charlie. She shrugged. "So you're the one with the quickened shadow?" Malhar looked flummoxed. Charlie didn't blame him. She turned to Posey. "The what?" Posey looked sheepish. "It is. Or at least it's something. You know how weird it was acting last night?" "I'm going to kill you," Charlie said, standing. "Straight up murder." "No one would blame me. I can't believe I let you drag me over here." Malhar held up his hands, forestalling violence. "We could do a few tests." Posey had told her in the car that she'd exaggerated the story, but Charlie still hadn't seen this coming. "No way. We're out of here. She's wasting your time. All she wants is for you to tell her how to wake up her shadow. She'd say anything if she thought it would convince you to do that." "Wait," Posey said, grabbing for her arm. "Let him look at it. Tell him the story." Charlie shook her off. She wanted to knock over her coffee. She wanted to throw a chair. And yet, another part of her wondered, could her shadow be magic? Wasn't it worth letting her sister get away with an extremely annoying scam if some of the information they got was actually helpful? "Fine," Charlie said, and threw herself back into the chair. "Go ahead. Test my shadow. Whatever. But when all this turns out to be bullshit, don't say I didn't warn you." Malhar held up his phone. "So it's okay if I record this?" Sure isn't, Charlie said. Come on, Posey said. You won't have to give your names on the recording, Malhar said. I'll keep your identities secret in my notes. This is just for me to go back over, so I'm sure I have everything right. No one else is going to hear this. Charlie looked between him and Posey. Okay. No names. Pressing a button, he put the cell down between them. Okay, well, we're rolling. We'll figure this out. First, tell me a little bit about yourself. Age. Any other details that seem important? I'm 28. None of the rest was anything Charlie was going to put on a recording. Not much more to know. How about you? He turned to Posey. Me? She had been nervously picking the skin around her thumbnail. She bit the edge of it and then seemed to notice what she was doing. She folded her hands on the table. You're going to be speaking on the recording. He smiled in a reassuring way. Posey raised her voice a little, as though afraid the recording wouldn't pick her up. I'm 25. I'm her sister and I read tarot cards for people over the internet. Really? Malhar asked. She nodded, tilting her head. I could do a spread for you. Yeah, maybe I could use one. He looked as though he was regretting everything about tonight. Let me explain a little bit about the project you're going to be a part of. It started as an ethnography, a cultural study of glomists. You know, a deep dive into that community. It seemed important when there were still people around with a living memory of it being secret, and others who only knew it primarily through seeing altered shadows in magazines. But the more people I talked to, the more I became interested in quickened shadows and their own ethnography. I was surprised by how differently shades were viewed in different eras and among different groups, which didn't fit the original concept of the thesis. So, my thesis ballooned. I started collecting historical references and comparing them with modern accounts. And then I needed more interviews. I've been spending a lot of my time defending my work to my professors. And my classmates. And my parents. They should be glad you're doing it, Charlie said. Isn't the University of Massachusetts interested in, founding a school for witchcraft and wizardry someday? Malhar snorted. There are physicists experimenting with aphotic shadows, and folklorists collating stories, biologists sewing cat shadows onto mice. But I am supposed to be an ethnographer, and everyone seems to think that I'm in too deep. Ah, Charlie said. You're the one interested in founding the School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. He shook his head, but he was smiling. You know I'm going to edit anything embarrassing that I say out of the transcript, right? What if I say something I want off the record? Charlie asked. I'll stop the tape for the duration of any comment you want to make and restart when we're done, he said. Is there something you want to say that you don't want on the tape? Maybe, she said. Malhar waited for her to say more, and when she didn't, nodded encouragingly, as though he was used to interviewing paranoid weirdos. Finally, he cleared his throat. Can you give me an account of what led to the change in your shadow? Charlie took a sip of the coffee, trying to figure out how to tell this story in a way that wouldn't come back to bite her in the ass. A man came into my job and used his shadow to rough me up. His shadow was like a fog 1 minute, and then something that was sort of like a paper doll cutout of a person crossed with a black hole. A shape made from a lack of light. It could become solid enough to knock over some bottles of liquor, and it... Charlie stopped at the memory of the thing flooding her lungs, the helplessness of that moment. She drank the rest of the coffee in a gulp, hoping the bite of bitterness would help. Unfortunately, it was bland and watery all the way to the bottom. Then the shadow went down my throat. It felt thick and heavy, like I had swallowed a storm cloud. I couldn't breathe. She looked down at the chipped nail polish on her thumb, so she didn't have to look at either of them. I was unconscious, although not for long. She thought of hearing Vince's voice when she woke, the softness in it when he'd spoken to Hermes, the softness in his voice when he spoke to her on the steps. I wish he was alive so I could kill him again.
Just some clarifications, Malhar said. Can you tell me how far the shadow was able to move from the person's body?
Probably about 25 feet, Charlie told him, glad to focus on the technical details instead of how she'd felt. But usually less than 10. He went through a series of questions like that. How often had it become solid? How solid had it become? Had it seemed connected to the glow mist? Had the glow mist seemed strained in any way or stopped to provide it blood? Had Charlie bled? And if she had, did the shadow seem distracted or interested in the blood? He made a note.
And did the shadow speak at any time?
Charlie shook her head, surprised by the question. Blights spoke, or at least some of them did. The very powerful ones, like Rowdy Joss, who'd been responsible for the Boxford massacre, or Xiang Zheng, who dictated many observations about the world to scholars around 220 AD and had been thought of as a ghost. Most blights were less clever than animals. A little low cunning borrowed from their human memories, mixed with the madness that afflicted most of them. But shadows were still tethered. They couldn't speak, at least not on their own. Well, she'd thought they couldn't. Posey must have been wondering the same thing.
They can talk?
Malhar hesitated. Not like he was trying to decide to answer, but like he was trying to decide how to put what he was about to say.
I don't know what you know about the mechanics of energy exchange that exists between glow mist and shadow.
Posey frowned. She didn't like to admit what she didn't know. But Charlie figured this was one of the things she'd want some definitive answers about. Tell us, Charlie said.
The average human, at rest, produces enough energy to power a light bulb, to charge a phone, and if we run, we produce enough to power an electric stove.
He shook his head.
I am being inexact. According to the first law of thermodynamics, energy can neither be created nor destroyed. So we don't make the energy. We convert it from food and water.
Posey nodded along with his explanation.
That's the energy that's passed along to shadows. They're a little like a parasite. The body produces excess energy anyway, and the magical parasite drains it off. The more energy it stores, the more powerful it becomes.
And that's how you make it do things, Posey said.
I noticed you had your tongue split, Malhar said. So I'm sure you've heard of the bifurcated consciousness. Glow-mists train their brains to be able to control their shadows simultaneously with controlling their own bodies. Ambidextrous people have an advantage. If you see a glow-mist without a split tongue, odds are they're ambidextrous.
Sure, Posey said impatiently. To her, this was basic stuff.
The problem is that a quickened shadow on its own doesn't store much energy. So, say a glow mist wants to do something that requires more energy than their shadow has. They could open a tap to their shadow, letting it pull energy from the glow mist. But leave the tap open too long and the glow mist will die. That's where the bifurcated soul comes in. If a glow mist puts some of themselves into their shadow, They can create a separate entity which holds energy. The shadow becomes a mirror self, reflected self, second self, upside down self. But the more powerful your shadow grows, the more it controls you.
Blights, Charlie said. Malhar nodded.
When the glow mist dies, yes. But I believe they are conscious long before that.
It occurred to Charlie that Malhar said he was studying the ethnography of shadows, and suddenly understood why his advisors might have thought he was in too deep. Was he hoping to interview one? Had he interviewed one?
Well, we should get to the testing part,
he said, perhaps seeing the expression on her face.
There are 3 things I'd like to try, but I am going to have to set up something first.
You're filming video? Charlie asked.
It's part of the test,
he said warily. Charlie frowned as he got out a stand and plugged a cord from his laptop into his phone. Don't even think about showing our faces. He nodded distractedly as he got out the ring lights. Then he took out a finger-stick lancet in plastic packaging.
Charlie, do you mind standing?
He asked, after he'd gotten his equipment where he wanted it to be. She got up.
Now, can either of you tell me what you observed that made you believe your shadow might have been affected by the experience?
It moved weirdly, Posey said. Not like she was controlling it or anything, but weird. He turned to Charlie.
Did you feed it blood?
I was cut up that night, she said. And then in the bathroom today, I picked off a scab. So, I don't know. Maybe. Posey looked betrayed to be hearing this for the first time. But considering that none of this would be happening if she hadn't betrayed Charlie's confidence, Charlie refused to feel bad about it.
Would you be willing to prick your finger now? Malhar asked. In front of the camera.
Sure. Charlie picked up the lancet and opened the package. She jabbed the tip into her finger and watched a sudden bead of red appear. All of them watched in silence. Nothing happened. Finally, Charlie licked her finger. Okay, that didn't work. Are we done? She wasn't sure how to feel. She didn't think she'd like to be a glow mist, but it still felt like failing a test.
Can you try to make it move?
Malhar asked, although he must have known it was useless. Charlie concentrated. She was at least a little bit ambidextrous, but her brain didn't feel particularly bifurcated.
Are you trying?
Posey asked. Charlie gave her sister a look.
Okay, last one,
Malhar said. He turned on the lights. The first sent her shadow towering against the wall to her left. Then the second came on. That ought to have doubled it, and yet it did nothing at all. Charlie stared, unwilling to believe what she was seeing. Is it? Malhar nodded, and when he spoke, his voice was hushed.
You have a quickening shadow. It's not fully there yet, but a day or 2 more of feeding it blood and it will be. I don't think I've ever seen one at this stage.
Charlie stared at her own shadow towering over her, her heart speeding. It was a part of her, she knew, but she couldn't help being a little afraid of it. What do I do?
You could stop feeding it,
Malhar said.
It would settle.
She nodded.
But you wouldn't do that,
said Posey, as though the option itself was an insult. Charlie took the neglected 3rd cup and drank some more lukewarm, watery coffee.
Or you could become a glow mist.
Malhar started breaking down the lights with a grin.
Some people are uncomfortable with the idea of quickened shadows. There are even fringe groups that believe we're being deceived as to their nature.
Posey snorted.
He's talking about the people who think that shadows are demons.
He nodded.
Or aliens. They think our minds are misinterpreting what our eyes are seeing because the truth is too horrible for the human mind to comprehend.
But Charlie's not crazy, Posey said. Charlie wasn't too sure about that. Okay, so what are quickened shadows?
Theoretically,
Malhar cautioned.
You've probably heard of dark matter. The stuff that's keeping gravity from ripping our galaxy apart. It has to be there, or all the other mathematical calculations fall apart. But no one can prove it. And well, dark energy is even more theoretical than that. Dark energy was used to explain ghosts, but is better suited to shadows. In some way, you could consider them ghosts of the living. And just like ghosts seem to be echoes of traumatic events, aphotic shadows are said to be formed out of trauma. Some professors here believe that aphotic shadows, like ghosts, reenact memories rather than have true life. Which is bullshit, by the way.
Aphotic? Charlie said.
Growing in the absence of light,
Malhar said apologetically.
The term caught on in academia.
So trauma is what quickens shadows? Posey's voice was a little breathless now that they'd come to the part of the conversation she was most interested in. Malhar frowned.
It seems to be, but trauma is highly individual. There are some very disturbing videos of people doing extreme and irresponsible things to wake their shadows. But they're unlikely to work because they don't carry emotional weight. Trauma is more than pain.
Charlie gave her sister a look. So, no ayahuasca? Malhar burst out laughing. Posey, caught between embarrassment and anger, went silent. We should go, Charlie said, standing up, trying not to take too much satisfaction in the moment. Malhar picked up his cell phone off the table.
I'd like you to talk to me again so I can monitor your shadow's progress. I hope you know you can trust me.
Can I ask you a question off the record? Charlie asked. He stopped the recording, frowning.
Sure.
Have you heard of a book called The Liber Noctum? His eyebrows went up.
The Book of Blights?
She nodded.
I heard about the auction, he said. There were a lot of wild claims that it was written by a blight, one that captured the breath of life. I'd love to get a look at it. One of the books everyone wants to study, like the Lucifer Treatise, or Codex Antumbra, or Fushi no Kage.
You think any of the claims are true? He shrugged.
Like that it was written by a blight? That would be fascinating. Almost all of the books on shadow magic are from the point of view of the glowmist. But what would it look like from the point of view of a shadow? One that was becoming conscious and learning how to follow its own desires.
Charlie wasn't entirely sure she wanted to know, but she was getting an idea why. 15. The past. With Rand gone, Charlie spent a few weeks kicking around. At school, she hung out with her friends. She had more time to go over to their houses and to party on the weekends. For years, she told herself that he was the one forcing her to participate in his schemes. But without them, Charlie found herself fidgety. She seemed to need more intensity than the people around her, required a higher dose of adrenaline before she felt anything. 6 months after Rand was buried, Charlie found herself back at the Moose Lodge. Benny laughed when he saw her walk through the door.
"Oh, come on, honey," he said. "You don't belong around here. Don't want to get the truant officer after us."
She dumped her backpack on one of the tables and walked around to the back of the bar. Checked the ice machine, which produced pellets that fused together and required vigorous use of the pick. She made him a martini just the way he liked it, cold vodka in a glass, with a garnish of several olives to take the sting out. "I want to do a job on my own," she told him as she pushed his drink toward him. "And I don't want to work for Knight." He frowned at her.
The Glooms are the ones that are hiring these days.
"Okay," she said, although her palms had started to sweat. "Just not him." He shrugged.
Willie's nephew, Stephen, got into stealing shadows. Says it's easy money. Says he can slash off a shadow the way you'd slash the strap of a purse. All you need is one of them onyx knives.
"So what, you mug people?" She made a face, having picked up from Rand a dislike of crimes that didn't require any real talent.
He's getting $250 a pop,
he said.
20 times that if it's one of those magic ones. But that's dangerous.
She nodded thoughtfully. He looked at her skeptically.
But you want a real job.
She straightened her shoulders. "What is it?"
The kind of thing one of us might have attempted in our heyday, you know? You know the Arthur Thompson house?
"Sure," Charlie told him. She'd gone there with her class freshman year.
There's this group of young gloamists who threw together some money and want someone to break in and steal a single page from one of the notebooks in a locked cabinet. It's supposed to have something to do with the use of shadows as absorbable energy to alter other shadows, blah, blah, magical crap. You think you can do that?
Arthur Thompson had invented harvesting electricity from storms and founded the first lightning farm around 30 years ago. That's what he'd been famous for, before the Boxford Massacre. That's what he ought to be best remembered for, according to Charlie's teachers, who wanted to preserve the legacy of a local legend in the face of kids' interest in the gruesome. In addition to his interest in lightning, Arthur Thompson was interested in shadow magic. Being a man of science, when he discovered a booth at the county fair run by a group of fundamentalists who believed that gloaming was the work of the devil, he and two of his friends stopped to argue. Long story short, they all got shot. Arthur died, and his shadow became a blight who killed over 100 people. But his house was preserved just the way he left it, including his workshop with all his notes. "What does it pay?" Charlie asked. Benny snorted.
500.
She eyed him, trying to figure out how much his cut was. "That doesn't sound like much. That's the price of 2 stolen shadows." He shrugged.
Yeah. You should probably stick to something easier.
She took the job. Charlie had always considered herself prickly as a sea urchin. But if she wanted to be the kind of con artist that Rand had been, she was going to have to get better at charm. It was one thing following his cues, and another being responsible for the whole thing. She practiced with the basics. The short change con, where you buy a pack of gum with a 20, then mess around trying to get the cashier to give you a 10 for $9 while pocketing your change, then correct yourself by turning over a 10 and getting your 20 back. It was some bullshit, but it required smooth talking and the appearance of honesty. Then the pig and poke, which was particularly effective for a teenager. Charlie pretended to find a ring on a street that looked like gold, or something similarly valuable, then asked a passerby if it was theirs. Lots of times, she didn't even have to suggest they give her a 20 and take the ring off her hands. They were so sure they were scamming her that they'd do it themselves. It helped her figure out how much to smile, How shy to be, how eager. And she made $60, which wasn't nothing. That Saturday, she got ready to pull her first job without Rand. A call to the Arthur Thompson house got her the first bit of information that she needed. She discovered which groups were touring the house Monday, then went to the thrift store closest to the Catholic school the museum staffer mentioned. There, she was able to find herself a school uniform. It looked slightly moth-eaten and the skirt had been hemmed extra short by its last owner. But it cost only $12 for the whole thing, including the white shirt. At home, she experimented with her hair. Pigtails made her feel as though she was wearing a costume. But when she pulled her hair back into a high ponytail, put on black stockings and lip gloss, and popped a piece of bubble gum in her mouth, it looked perfect. It would be easy to get in. It was a museum after all, and welcomed visitors. But much harder to get into a locked study and then a locked cabinet without anyone noticing. And much harder to cut a page out of a book and leave with it before getting stopped. On Monday, she put her plan into swing. She told her mother she was sleeping over at Laura's house, then forged a doctor's note for school. Then she took the bus to Northampton. From a discreet distance, she watched the kids troop inside, gave them 15 minutes, and showed up. "I'm late," she told the woman at the front desk, looking as panicked as she was able. "I'm so sorry. My mom had to drop me off and I'm going to be in so much trouble. They're here, right? Can I go in?" The woman hesitated, but only for a moment. "Go in, hurry." Charlie dashed past and joined up with them, relieved that the first part was over. She found the class but stayed clear of them until they went into Arthur Thompson's study. Then she moved into the flood of students and slid inside. This was the important part, because the door was alarmed and only one group was let in at a time. Their teacher, a rather young-looking priest with an Eastern European accent, cleared his throat.
Now, we're going to listen with our ears, not with our mouths.
Charlie slid behind a bookshelf. A museum staffer began to go into Arthur Thompson's childhood, the challenges of Harvard in the 80s, how the prototype of the lightning harvesting mechanism shocked him badly enough that he spent 6 weeks in a hospital.
"Is that when his shadow became magic?"
asked one of the girls. The priest gave her a speaking look, but the museum staffer nodded.
"That's generally thought to be the case, since he pursued shadow magic after that. He joined some of the early message boards and even originated calculations about the energy exchange between the glow mist and their shadow." "So what happened to him?" asked a boy in the back. "Did you not do the reading, Tobias?" the priest demanded. "No, I mean the shadow," the kid said. "Rowdy Joss. He called himself once he was a blight, right? Like, did they hunt him down?" "Nothing about that was in the reading," said the priest. "And we don't need to waste the time of the staff." "I saw the video," the kid said. "Online."
The staffer smiled, although the smile had become slightly strained. No one knows what happened to Arthur's shadow after the Boxford massacre. There was some speculation that the transfer of energy created memory loss, or that it was confused. But remember that Rowdy Joss wasn't Arthur. Arthur died at the Boxford massacre, a victim like everyone else that day. Charlie listened to the conversation follow a familiar pattern, as the teacher and staffer valiantly struggled to get it back on track. 15 minutes later, the class filed out, leaving Charlie hidden behind the bookshelf. She waited until the room was empty to scoot out and crawl beneath Arthur Thompson's enormous desk. She watched feet move back and forth, realizing she should have come in with the last group and not the third from last group. But it wasn't like she had to worry too much about not making noise or moving or something. Sound was all around her, a cacophony of giggling and gum chewing and lectures. And then the final group filed out. From the other room, she heard the museum staffers, all two of them, talking together. One of them laughed. Then, distressingly, the hum of a vacuum began. But it wasn't brought into the study and faded away after a few minutes. Charlie breathed a sigh of relief. She listened as the locks were engaged and the alarms set. Outside, night had fallen. Charlie crawled out, more nervous than she thought she'd be. Despite all the houses she'd walked through, this felt different. The slightest sound made her start. Taking a few steadying breaths, she used her phone to give her enough light that she could pick the lock of the cabinet. It took her 3 tries before her fingers were finally steady enough to open the door. Behind it, she found the notebook they wanted. It was one of the ones on display. She flipped through until she found a page marked Shadow Energy Exchange, then took a razor out of her backpack. But as she got ready to slice, she felt guilty. It seemed wrong to hack up a book. When it was Rand doing stuff, she never had to think about morals. He was a bad guy, and they were doing bad stuff, and that was that. Charlie ate a granola bar from her backpack, looking at the cabinet. She walked around the room, looking at the photos. Arthur Thompson's original sketches of the lightning farm. A congratulatory letter from the governor. And in one corner, a letter from someone claiming to be a blight in a looping, spidery hand. To A. Thompson in the city of Northampton. You have been trying to contact me, and I urge you to desist. Yes, there are ancient beings in the shadows, but you are better off letting us stay that way. I have no interest in being studied. My origin may have been with your kind, but I am of you no longer. Written on the 23rd day of April by Cleophas of York. She frowned at it, wondering if Arthur Thompson's blight was still hanging around, writing letters. Finally, Charlie took out her phone and took a photo of the page from the notebook. It had the same information, and if that's what they wanted, this ought to be enough. Even as she did it, she had the sinking feeling that she was screwing up, but she couldn't bring herself to slice out the page. Then she went to the windows, hoping there was a way out, but they were alarmed. Charlie sat down in the chair, spun it a bit, played a game on her phone, crawled back under the desk and napped. And then she saw something in the window. A shadow in the corner of the room sliding away from the wall. Charlie curled up more tightly and tried not to breathe. It moved across the room, pausing at a strip of black tile that crisscrossed the floor. Then the shadow stepped over, becoming more solid as it did. For a moment it took on features, as though of the gloom controlling it. Then it was past the onyx tiles and to the cabinet. It flooded through the keyhole, and the cabinet door swung open. Then the shadow became solid again, as though someone shaped the night into a human form. It must have to be like that to carry the book. Charlie's heart thundered, and she held her breath again as it passed her by. It left the book tucked into a corner of the room, in a basket of rolled-up architectural plans that might have been reproductions. As it flooded out the window, Charlie realized why it hadn't taken the book with it. It couldn't get it out the window or the door any better than Charlie could. But it could relocate the book, so that the glow-mist could come in tomorrow and slide it into his bag and leave without anyone the wiser. It was almost dawn when she decided the shadow wasn't waiting outside and went over to the basket to look at the book. And scowled. It was the exact volume she'd been sent to slice the page from. and belatedly, with a sense of wicked glee, she opened the book and took out her razor. Whoever the gloamist was who was attempting to take the book was going to be very surprised when he got it. She hoped he was furious. She had the sudden, wild urge to sign her work and fought it down. By the time the first class filed in the next day, Charlie was feeling giddy with victory and desperately in need of a toilet to pee in. As they left, Charlie scrambled out from under the desk and behind the bookshelves. One more class, one more lecture, and then she was out of there. The next group filed into the study. Charlie smiled at a boy who moved to stand near her. She wiped the edge of her mouth and then frowned at him. "You have something," she said. He knuckled where she'd pointed, and she reached out to fix it for him. "There," she said. "Got it." Charlie managed to stay out of sight of the teachers until it was time to leave. Then she tried to file out with the others, head down. Just at the door, she heard a voice. "Hey," one of the teachers said. "You're not with this class." She turned around guiltily, lipstick smudged. Watched the teacher's eye go to the boy, whose mouth she'd smeared with her lipstick. "Keith!" she said. And then Charlie was out the door and out of the museum, with what she hoped was a believable excuse for hightailing it out of there. Benny set up her meeting for later in the day, at the parking lot behind a coffee shop in the middle of town. 3 20-something glooms showed up. One of them had a vape pen in her mouth. Another was carrying a skateboard. They looked at her, as though they would never have hired her if they'd realized how young she was. "Here's your 300, the gloom with the vape pen said, gesturing airily. Charlie opened her mouth to object, and one of the others interrupted, smirking. "Take it or leave it." "Leave it," Charlie said. "Where are you going to sell the page, if not to us?" said the boy. "You think anyone else is going to give you a better deal?" Charlie wondered if it was one of them who'd sent their shadow into the Arthur Thompson house, cutting out the others. Or if it was someone one of them had talked to, trying to snake it out from under them. She could tell them, she supposed, but she didn't like them enough. 600, or I set it on fire, and the price is going up every time you negotiate. They looked at one another. "No way." 700, Charlie said. One of them laughed, and she fished a lighter out of the bottom of her bag, flicked the flint wheel. "Fuck off," said the one with the skateboard. Charlie set the page on fire. It caught fast, burning to cinder in moments as they screamed. The ashes blew around, black shapes circling in the wind like shadows. She sneered at the glooms, fighting down a wave of exhaustion at the lost night, the frustration at losing when she'd been so sure she'd won, and the certainty that this would have never happened to Rand. "Do you know what you did?" the one with the vape pen demanded. "I made sure no one would ever stiff me again," Charlie said and walked off, keeping her head high and her shoulders squared. That night she uploaded the photo she'd taken online. Sometimes she still saw it passed around. She could always tell it was hers, because a corner of her finger was visible at the edge. 16. Lick your wounds. By the time Vince got home, Charlie pretended to be asleep, evening out her breaths, tucking her cheek against the pillow, pressing her nose to the cloth. He stood in the doorway, looking at her long enough for the hairs to rise along the back of her neck. She knew she would have to confront him, but not now. not when she was exhausted and the anger she should be feeling had somehow drained away, leaving her heavy with sadness. She didn't want Vince to be Lionel Salt's grandson, didn't want to have to wonder how far he'd go to protect his identity. If he'd murdered Hermes for recognizing him as Edmund Carver, did that mean he'd murder her too? He can't realize I know, she reminded herself. At least not yet. But she still imagined Vince lying beside her, taking her pillow, and smothering her with it. Imagined him holding a knife from her own kitchen behind his back as he got closer to the bed. Got distracted by remembering that she'd bought those knives at a TJ Maxx and they always needed sharpening. The last time she cut open a butternut squash, she'd really had to saw her way through. That would be a terrible way to go. And given how fast he got rid of the last body, he wouldn't have any trouble getting rid of hers too. She didn't doubt that he had all the right solvents to clean things up so well that a forensic team would be hard-pressed to find evidence. A shudder went across her shoulders, and she bit her cheek to keep herself still. That old chestnut about killers occurred to her. A quiet guy, kept to himself. That did describe Vincent. She stayed still as he folded his pants and put his shirt in the laundry basket. Didn't move as he set his watch on the dresser, plugged his phone into the charger. Maybe she should get out ahead of this. When you lived with someone, it ought to be easy enough to incapacitate them. Horse tranquilizers, food poisoning, offering to tie him to the bedposts for sex. Then she could interrogate him, force him to admit everything, ask him all the questions she'd always wanted to know. And yet, what she longed for was for him to slide into bed and put his hand on her shoulder, to tell her he knew she was awake, to say that he loved her desperately and wanted to confess all the things he'd kept from her and all the reasons for them. It was a childish desire, a wish for the world not to be as it was, for people to act in ways they just didn't. It was the wish of a sucker, ready to be fleeced for everything she had. Vincent Damiano isn't a real person. She'd been so busy trying to make sure Vince didn't see behind her masks that she didn't notice that he was all mask. Hole in the head, hole in the heart, or hole in the pocket. The Hall family curse. Eventually, he left the room, flicking off the overhead light. She lay alone in the dark, eyes open. Outside, the street lights shone. Behind her neighbor's houses, the old mill building rose, dark too, with the bright silver coin of the moon above. It wasn't until the red light of dawn bled onto the horizon that she finally slept. Charlie woke in the early afternoon, alone. She stumbled out of bed, then poked her head into her sister's room to make sure that Vince hadn't gone crazy and chopped her in half or something. Posey was sleeping, one arm flung over her ancient MacBook. Charlie put on a robe, went to the kitchen, and poured herself a mug of bitter, lukewarm coffee. She slid a steak knife into the pocket of the robe. Then she waited, stomach churning. It was time to have the real talk. 20 minutes later, Vince came back in with 2 bags of groceries. Charlie couldn't help seeing the space through his rich boy eyes. All the worn things, the grease stains, the shabbiness. He took a look at her expression and set the bags on the counter, making no movement to unpack. Did something happen? You lied, Charlie said, meeting his pale eyes. He didn't look defensive yet, but he did look wary. Trying to figure out which lie I'm talking about? It must be hard when there are so many, she snapped. Edmund Carver. Don't call me that, he said. Because you prefer Remy? Or because you're afraid someone will hear? She'd thought it would feel terrible to confront him, but it felt great to have the nastiness inside her finally spilling out. Was it hard to sleep on a mattress on the floor and not between your 1 billion thread count sheets? He shook his head. I swear to you, it wasn't like that. But when she looked at him, all she saw was the Edmund Vincent Carver of the society pages, disdain in his smoked-colored eyes. Just a little pomade, the tilt of his jaw, and he'd be a stranger. If only she'd observed him more closely, she'd have seen it. Picking out that Vacheron Constantine watch at 20 paces, knowing about the vacation homes of the upper class, the fucking love of gossip for fuck's sake. Not to mention the ability to murder people and believe there would be no consequences. Oh, you swear it. Well, then it must be true, she said, a snarl in her voice. I wanted to start over. Vince's voice stayed soft, with no part of my old life. I didn't want you to see me the way I used to be. That's a good line, but it doesn't explain how you're supposed to be dead, Charlie told him. Or how everyone's looking for a book you stole, including the guy who tried to kill me. Too bad you didn't keep that in the duffel in the back of our bedroom closet, along with your real license. You went through my things. The sudden flatness of his voice was unnerving. But Charlie rushed on, all her hurt finally alchemizing into anger. That's right. I found the license, and then I found the newspaper story about how you murdered a girl and then yourself, she said. You want me to feel bad about invading your privacy? Yes, he said, rubbing his hand over his face. A little. I don't know. You know what else? I heard everything you said to Hermes, all of it. That's when I knew you were lying. And now I know why you killed him, because he recognized you. Vince shook his head again, as though he could shake off her words. Go on, she said. Deny it. Tell me you're not a pretend person in a pretend relationship. Is that what you really think? His eyes were bright with a fury she'd never seen before, shining with rage. It made her hesitate. What am I supposed to think? How many people did you kill for Lionel Salt? Lots, he said, and closed his eyes. She stared at him in horror. The girl? He shook his head. No, not Rose. How about the man they found in the car? The body you let everyone think was yours? Her voice was as cold as she could have hoped, and as relentless. I couldn't make myself stop, he began. Killing? She finished for him. My hand slipped and it happened to have an axe in it. Again, whoops. I'll go, he said abruptly, and turned toward the hall to their bedroom. You'd rather leave than answer? She shouted after him. He kept walking, his hand going to the wall at one point as though he needed to catch himself. Of course he was going to go. Of course he was only there when she was easy, when everything was easy. The cat followed him, tail lashing in an accusatory manner. Charlie followed him. Okay, where's the Lieber Noctum? How about that? Everyone wants to know. Hermes did. What, so you can steal the book from me? He asked, yanking open a drawer. Ideally, Charlie told him from the doorway, watching him start to stuff clothes in a bag. It would sure make me a lot of money. He stopped packing. Salt is playing a game, and someone is playing a game with him.
They want to make pawns out of all of us. The worst thing anyone could do is find that book.
Okay. Explain, she said.
Tell me what's going on.
I can't, he told her.
You don't want to,
she said.
You never wanted me, did you? You only wanted somewhere to hide out and lick your wounds. You never loved me.
He looked as though she'd slapped him. Then something in his expression shifted, became a locked house at night, alarms set.
What do you know about love? He said, hefting his duffel onto his shoulder. I wasn't the only one who lied.
Charlie opened her mouth, but of all the things she had been ready to answer for, that hadn't been one of them.
Maybe I didn't tell you everything about me, but that's not the same as pretending to be someone. You're right, he shouted, interrupting her.
It was frightening to see him let go after so many months of restraint. And there was something in his eyes that made her wonder if he was afraid too.
I couldn't give you what you needed. I kept things from you, even if you didn't know what was wrong. You could tell there wasn't enough of me. I wish I could say I was sorry, that I wanted to be honest the whole time, but I didn't. I never wanted to be honest. I just wanted what I told you to be the truth. Tell me anyway, she yelled back, unwilling to back down. Be honest now. At least you owe me that. I don't, he said. I won't. Fine, then fuck you. Run away. That's what you do, right? Go find another stupid girl to con.
The cat lunged and climbed halfway up Charlie's ankle and bit down on her calf 3 times in succession.
Ow, shit!
She shouted as Lucifer leaped away, racing into the other room.
The fuck is your problem, cat?
Vince smiled, eyebrows going up, and Charlie laughed. A moment later, she was furious with herself for laughing and with the cat for being a demonic asshole, but she couldn't help it. And in that moment, she wondered if maybe she was wrong in thinking she didn't know Vince, that maybe there was some truer truth beneath the lies. There was still a trace of a grin on his face when he turned away from her, duffel over his shoulder. It's not what you think, Vince said, from the mouth of the hall. He didn't turn, so she couldn't even try to interpret his expression. The humor had left his voice, though.
Oh, yeah?
She called after him.
Then why are you leaving?
Because it's worse. A few minutes later, she heard the screen door bang. Charlie had to press her nails into her palm to force herself not to chase after him. Then the engine of the van started. Then the sound of tires on the crumbling asphalt of the driveway. Charlie kicked the dresser. It hurt her bare feet more than she hurt the chipboard. She kicked it again. Not only was there something so deeply wrong with her that the guy she'd been sure was a good person turned out to be a murderer who faked his own death and also the grandson of a person she hated, but even that guy left her. She was a poisoned well of a girl. Charlie kicked the dresser a 3rd time for good measure. And yet, she wouldn't unknow any of it. She would have still stolen the receipt, called the bookstore, whispered mangled French, gone through his stuff. That was her problem. Charlie Hall, never satisfied, unless every last carcass was turned over and every last maggot revealed. No, she was going to not think about the last 48 hours. She was going to rob Adam and then turn him over to Doreen, just like she'd planned. At least Charlie could torment someone else's terrible boyfriend, since she no longer had one of her own. Charlie vaguely remembered that she wasn't supposed to want to do things like that. But that was back when she was trying to be good. Trouble had found her once again, and she was ready to welcome it back. And if Adam happened to have the Liber Noctum, if by some chance he'd lifted it off Vince, so much the better. Revenge on everybody. That would fill her time. That would keep her busy. Keep her from feeling her feelings. If she couldn't be responsible or careful or good or loved, if she was doomed to be a lit match, then Charlie might as well go back to finding stuff to burn.